Hello everyone, I'm Ollie. This is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror. It's a Goosebumps book, my very first Goosebumps book that I've ever read, despite being very old. So it's Deep Trouble, which of course is by RL Stine. So appropriately for this, because it's about sea monsters and sharks and stuff, I'm wearing my Jaws t-shirt. So the first question to answer is, why have I never read a Goosebumps novel? Well, the reason is that by the time they started doing this kind of thing, I was already much too old to read them. So I don't know when the Goosebumps books started, but I think sometime in the 90s, by which point I was already I was 18 in 91. So I had already moved on to adult horror. And when I was a kid, there was nothing like this at all. So when I think back to the kind of books that introduced me to horror, they were adult horror books. So I guess I read, when I was younger, I read like some of the Doctor Who books, which you could argue have elements of horror in them. But aside from that, I think the first, real horror that I read was probably H.P. Lovecraft. And then moved on to Stephen King, pretty quickly after that, and then everything else thereafter. So yeah, as a kid growing up in the 70s, so I guess I was born in 73. So in the late 70s, early 80s, there was really nothing that I was aware of anyway, in the kind of what you would call the horror genre. To read. Actually, thinking about it, I was a huge fan when I was a kid of the Fighting Fantasy game books, which are like choose your own adventure type things. And there was one of those called, I think it might have been called Hell House or House of Hell or something like that, which was definitely horror themed. But yeah, aside from that, very little. So yes, I was very interested. A lot of the booktubers I follow are younger people who grew up on the Goosebumps books. And who absolutely love them, and definitely big shout out to Monster Blood, who's a really dedicated Goosebumps fan and does fantastic videos on the books. So if you're a fan of the Goosebumps books, you should definitely check out his channel. I'll link to it. But yeah, I was interested to see what all the fuss was about, and this was one that we had in the house because a few years ago I bought it for my son, but we never actually got around to reading it, and it's just kind of been languishing on his bookshelf. So I grabbed it and thought I'd give it a try. And I have to say, I really enjoyed it. It's clearly a children's book in terms of the style of the prose and things like that. The sentences are very short, it's very to the point. But as a story, it's really fun. So it's about a kid called Billy Deep, who's 12, who's got a younger sister, Sheena, who's 10, and they're staying with their uncle, who's like a marine biologist type guy. So they're staying on his kind of research boat, and they go off swimming around it and things like that. And Billy's got a very active imagination, whereas Sheena is much more practical. Yeah, so it's written in the first person from Billy's perspective, and he keeps on coming across what he thinks are sea monsters. And there's a great tension in the first part of the book because none of the adults and Sheena, they don't believe him at all. So you never really know whether he's actually seen a sea monster or if it is just his imagination, because you as the reader don't get quite enough detail. You get, like he says, like he feels something grabbing his leg or something like that, and he looks down and sees this shape, but you as the reader never really know. So there's a fantastic tension in the first third or so of the book about whether or not there really is something. It then moves on, and it turns out the uncle gets approached by a zoo who've heard that there are mermaids in the area, and they want him to capture a mermaid to display in the zoo. And this is kind of slightly getting into spoiler territory, but I figure chances are, given the kind of things that I normally cover, most of my viewers probably won't be wanting to read a Goosebumps book anyway. And if you do like Goosebumps book, you've probably already read this one because it's one of the original series. I think it's quite an early one. I think it was book 19 in the original series. So anyway, his uncle gets offered $1 million by this zoo to find a mermaid, so that they can exhibit it in the zoo. And there's thereafter this other kind of tension in the book about do mermaids really exist and can they find a mermaid, but also if they do, is it morally right for the uncle to take this money to effectively sell a living sentient creature to be exhibited in a zoo. And it's a kid's book, so he doesn't get too deeply into that, but there's definitely some interesting stuff there about about human exploitation of animals, but also human exploitation of other humans, a mermaid being something that is half animal, half human, really. So I won't go too much further in terms of the story, so I don't completely spoil it for you if you do ever read it. But there's some interesting tensions there beyond the kind of normal tension that you'd expect in a kind of horror adventure type book. And what you do get, I said the writing style is quite basic. Basically every chapter ends with a cliffhanger. It's a lot like a Dan Brown book in that respect. So it really does keep you interested and keep you reading. The action moves incredibly quickly. The chapters are all very short, but you'll get to the end of the chapter, something really dramatic will happen, the next chapter will start, and that dramatic thing will be resolved pretty much immediately, and then it moves on to the next dramatic thing. So it's very enjoyable, and I read it in like an hour and a half or something like that, and maybe even less, because it's short and incredibly easy to digest. But I did really enjoy it, and I can see why. As a first taste of horror, it certainly wasn't scary, but it was tense, and I can see why, this kind of thing being the first taste of horror that lots of people got, who then, grew up to love the genre. I can see how it, how it is a good formation for a lifelong love of horror. The other thing that struck me about it when I was reading it, which I thought I wanted to talk to you guys about a bit, was RL Stine wrote dozens, if not hundreds of these, and clearly they were hugely successful. I think it says here somewhere that this one, so just this one book in the series, had, at the point this edition of it was published, had sold 2 million copies, which is a lot, and there were loads of books in the series, so he sold millions and millions of books. And it occurred to me that a lot of the books I do talk about on the channel are similar in that they are they're pulps, and this really is in a lot of ways this is a pulp for kids, pulp book for kids. It's it's mass produced almost, it's churned out, but the fact I have huge respect for someone like Stine, who was able to do this again and again and again. And people who watch the channel will know that one of my favourite authors is Ed McBain, who wrote his 87th Precinct series, which is probably my favourite book series ever. There are 55 books in that series alone, and he wrote other series and other standalones and things like that. And that dedication to the craft, that means you can just keep on. I want to say churning out, but that seems disrespectful because and inaccurate as well, because they're not churning these books out. They are creating book after book after book that work for readers. So it's not, whilst you could look at it as almost like mass production, it's not mass production, because each book is distinct in its own right and gives pleasure in its own right to the reader. So yeah, I thought it was interesting. The Mac Bolan books, I've just finished this one. It was the last book I finished before the Goosebumps book. What happened with these ones, Don Pendleton only wrote the first 2 dozen or so. And then after that, they hired people to ghostwrite them, whereas Stine, did them all, and I think that's a phenomenal achievement. And certainly, as I've said, he introduced so many people who now love horror to the genre. So I think massive respect to him. I'll be honest, I probably won't read a load more Goosebumps novels, but I did enjoy this enough that when I checked in with Monster Blood, Austin, he said this wasn't one of the best. So I'm going to look out for, when I'm off my book buying ban, I'm going to look out for copies, because you do see these in charity shops often, and try and pick up some of the ones that he really rates, and give those a try as well, because this was really fun, but it wasn't particularly creepy. So I quite like to read Stine doing something a bit creepier, and see how that feels. Anyway, that was my impressions on my first Goosebumps book. As always, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you are all keeping safe and well. Get jabbed, wear a mask, all that good stuff, and I will speak to you again soon. Cheerio.